So welcome everyone again. I am Maria Perbellini, the Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at NYIT, and I want to welcome our guest panelists, our faculty. I don't know, we should have also students and staff joining us tonight. And this is another panel regarding something very critical that we are actually proposing in our school. The conversation is not just through our lecture series, but we are also going through dialogues and events and lectures and symposia and opportunities for the students to be exposed to a dialogue on critical issues that we are all facing today. Critical density will bring together a group of experts with varied backgrounds and expertise to assess the immediate impact of the context of this intertwined crisis and to speculate and communicate possible opportunities for innovation in dense cities. Particularly the scale and the resonance of issues we are facing today demand the expansion of research skills, the emphasis of innovative, interdisciplinary, cross-college research initiatives and degree plans. That's what we are actually offering in our school, exactly responding to those issues and the resonance of those issues, and propelling collaborations and the sharing and distribution of experimentations towards the attainment of a conscious purpose expertise for a greater impact on our life. I would like to welcome Professor Tom Verebes and Associate Professor Pablo Eiroa. They are going to be the moderators tonight, but we also have faculty responding, Robert Cody, Marcella Del Signore, and Dong Sei Kim that will help the conversation with questions to our panelists. And now, please, Tom or Pablo, if you would like to introduce our guests. My pleasure. Thank you
very much, Dean. It's actually Nader Vasugian and myself who will be moderating. And maybe over to you, Nader, and then
apologies.
No worries. Thank you.
Apologies, Nader.
No problem, Maria.
Our fabulous Nader Vasugian, of course.
Well, we're so thrilled that you can join us all this evening to participate in this conversation. This is a discussion that's taking place, I think, across at least 2 continents and in multiple time zones. So especially those of you who are across the pond, you know, we're really grateful that you're taking time away from your sleep to join us. Before I pass things on to my colleague, Tom Verebes, I just wanted to explain, you know, what was going through our minds when we came up with this event and began to conceptualize it. And in part, it emerged out of discussions that started over the summer with regard to the future of New York. In other words, is New York dead? There's a now infamous editorial that was published in the New York Post in August, declaring the death of New York. And then our friend Jerry Seinfeld published a rebuttal in the New York Times promptly thereafter. And of course, his position was that it's not dead. It's more alive than ever. And, you know, rather than kind of coming up with these facile dead or not positions, we thought that we would use this opportunity to nuance the discussion and to also discuss issues of urban density more broadly as they intersect with issues of public health, but also issues of social and economic justice. Which I think very quickly come to the surface. So we're really eager to hear your thoughts. And we're also eager to hear you speak from your own particular vantage point, because, you know, we're not out of the dark on this yet. This is a pandemic that is ongoing. And so I think it would be disingenuous for us to try and speak dispassionately with any kind of distance, because we're all going through this right now together. And this is an opportunity to start thinking collectively. So thank you for joining us, and I really, really look forward to the conversation and hearing your thoughts. And I'll pass things to my colleague, Tom Verabes.
Thank you very much, Nader. Both Nader and I were very grateful to Dean Perbolini and also our Lectures and Events Committee, where these discussions about our current context or ongoing context was shaped over the summer, as Nader was saying. And I'll sketch a little bit more additional background and context for this event before introducing our panelists and respondents. So until earlier in our year 2020, dense cities were very much heralded as one of the panaceas for the global crisis of ecological sustainability and resilience. The benefits for the environment of density, along with a lot of economic efficiencies of compact cities, were very much well established and accepted paradigms. But the COVID-19 pandemic seemed to have changed some of those beliefs in some people quite quickly. And so a constellation of challenges, of course, emerged from public health and in turn, a global economic downturn. First, we have Lydia Calipoliti, who joins us well from the Cooper Union in New York, but from tonight, late night in Greece. Lydia is an assistant professor at the Cooper Union, architect, writer, and curator, and director of her practice, Anna Cycle, based in New York. Peter Anker, who is director of global design and professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University down the road. Third, who will be speaking, Alberto Estevez, joining us from Barcelona, who's the director of the Masters in Biodigital Architecture at the Universitat Internacional de Catalunya, UIC, in Barcelona. Fourth to speak will be Claudia Pasquero, professor of landscape architecture at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Also, she holds positions of lecturer in architecture at the Bartlett at UCL University College London, and director of Ecologic Studio together with her partner Marco Poletto. And last to speak will be Giovanni Barassi, director of one of the preeminent cultural institutions in architecture, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, CCA, in Montreal. And we're grateful for all five of you. And then we'll be joined by respondents, Robert Cody, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture and Design, Marcella Del Signore, Director of the Master of Science in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design Program, Postgrad MS Program, and also Associate Professor. And last but not least, Dong-Se Kim, Assistant Professor in the School of Architecture and Design. So I'd like to introduce, more specifically, to unmute your microphone, please. Join us in welcoming Lydia Calipoliti as our first speaker.
I did not know I was going to be first, but I have no problem. I can do this. Let me share.
I'd sent an email early this morning, but if that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I read the line and I was fourth, but it's okay. No, it's right here. So.
Sorry, I'm sorry. No. You're absolutely right. Our secret was not that. But if you want to, if you do, you were fourth.
Whatever you want. I'm completely fine. In my list, it reads that Peter is first.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I was going through. Yes, Peter. Join us, please, to welcome Peter Anker, who, just to remind everybody again, is the director of global design, a program at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University. Thank you. Sorry about that, Lydia.
Thank you so much, Tom, Nader, and Dean Perbolini. And I should actually go after Lydia because she's so amazing. But I will go ahead then. Actually, I'm here speaking on behalf of a group. So what I'm going to say is on behalf of me, of course, but also Mitchell Joachim and Nicolas Gervasi, who's we're both at Terraform and New York University. Because we just came out with an article published in Topos magazine like a couple of days ago or something. And that's what I'm going to present today. So you don't have to read the magazine, although it's a really cool magazine, actually. The article is called Deep Impact Animal, Plant, and Insect-Aided Design, and really has to do with the environment and nature. So here we go on behalf of the three of us. This article is actually also slated, I think, to go into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, at least being reviewed there, so you'll see what's happening. So it has that sort of flavor of trying to speak to a larger audience. We have, we kind of, there are three problems with the city I would like to sort of start with and point out. And that is one, the city has usually been understood as a place for human beings. You know, we think about houses and cars and streets, and our first point is like, that's actually not the case. And it's almost irresponsible to think about the cities and urban habitats for human beings. There are lots of other species who live in the city. And when we plan the city, we need to start including non-human species. Maybe think about the city as in a sort of biocentric terms instead of anthropocentric terms, meaning we need to actually start planning and thinking about how to help other species to adopt and live and flourish in the city. The other problem that we point out is that the cities are growing like crazy. This is partly fed by the population growth around the world, but also fed by people moving into the city. So we are kind of soon living in, you know, I think it's the Greek architect Doxiadis described as sort of mega, ultra big city of some sort. And that's kind of where we're moving. And that has all kind of challenges and problems with it, but also perhaps opportunities. And the third point we're trying to make about the cities today is that we used to think them as contained spaces. So when I say Berlin, we think about all those people living in Berlin, and that's where it is on the map, so to speak. But that may not be a good way of thinking about, you know, a city anymore, because everything seems to be moving in and out of the city. Humans, of course, move in and out of the city all the time. You know, tourists, people come and go, they stay for a while, move on. Maybe I'm living too long in New York City to kind of think in this way, but people come and go, literally. And they also travel in and out of the city a lot. But not only humans, also animals and plants, insects, you name it, are moving in and out of the city. But then all stop there. We can also think about the material part of the city. And here I'm inspired by the work of Kiel Mo, his book, Empire State Building, where he shows that even bricks and steel and mortar and cement and all those juicy things and glass have traveled far to get into the city. And when they tear down a building, they will travel even further. So the idea of thinking about the city as a place, we need to kind of question that. So those are the three kind of issues. One, the move from anthropocentric to biocentric. Two, the growth of the city. And three, the whole city is moving. Okay, it's not stable anymore. And that really challenges the way we think about cities in general. Then there's problems, all kind of problems associated with this, and I will point out a couple of them. First of all, we're trying desperately to adapt to this new state, right? In different ways. Architect designers think about, you know, we shouldn't have, you know, in sustainability, we shouldn't let material move that far. Let's be sustainable about the carbon footprint of moving. Maybe we should, you know, have less children, you know, or and so on. Animals too try to adapt. Animals, where I've read about fascinating stories about animals who now sing louder in the city. And birds, I'm thinking about birds that sing louder because there's so much noise from the cars that they have to sing louder in order to be heard, right? And the other, apparently there's a lizard in Puerto Rico that has bigger feet because it now goes on concrete buildings. So these are animals trying desperately to adapt to that, and the plants too trying to adapt. And some do well, as we know with cockroaches and some insects that is really sort of flourishing, right? And rats. Others are not doing so well. Indeed, it's kind of not going so well with this adaptation. Lots of species are going extinct. A lot of species are not surviving this city and going extinct thanks to the city, and that's something we need to also think hard about. this extinction problem actually is of kind of two parts. One is the biological extinction, the species that are dying out, but it's also cultural extinction. Languages are dying out, and customs and cultures, indigenous culture. Here in New York City, the indigenous population that used to live here, they are now moved out, and they are now in a small little reservation on Long Island. So things are there's problem with cultures too going extinct thanks to this, and we got this sort of everyone is becoming more or less similar. I heard that in New York City there's about 800 languages spoken, but you know what? I mostly hear English, right? So that's kind of, and Spanish, of course. So what do we do? What do we do with this kind of situation? First of all, we should rebel. Let's be very frank about it. We should be absolutely furious. And I'm part of the Extinction Rebellion. I mean, it's not in like a haha to be funny, let's rebel. I mean it like really, let's rebel. Because what's happening is not good. So yes, I've been out there, and doing crazy stuff to try to get attention to this issue. But in addition to that, into rebelling, which is kind of fun thing to do actually, meet new friends and so on, we need to type of mitigation. We try to kind of look for doing it. And we need to start with animal-aided design. Think about ways of designing buildings and designing roads, designing the city so that, birds, animals, fish will do all right. They will actually have a good time, maybe flourish. Can we make the cloac a good place for fish to swim? Can we make the buildings, the facades, the rooftops, and so on be places where there can be greeneries and maybe urban farming, maybe other ways of including other species? Then we have to really think hard about insects. It is as we haven't really talked about insects in the city. They're always described as a nuance. Cockroaches, the beetles, whatnot, are encroaching into our living space. We don't want them in our shower. Get out, and let's pester them with kind of cleaning products to get them out. But we should actually start thinking seriously about how to make our cities so we're welcoming to insects, and not only bees for honey, because insects is what birds feed on. That's what lots of animals are dependent on insects in order to survive. And we were looking in vain for literature of how to cope with insects and make the insects thrive in the city. So that's something to think through. And then, of course, we need to start including more plants everywhere. So that's of different sorts, plants that we can eat for agriculture, but also plants for pleasure and that are good for the insects and the birds and the fish and the animals. And fourthly, we need to, so that, here are the points here being to summarize the animal-aided design, the insects, the plants, that's number 3, and number 4, this debate about carbon footprint. Yes, it's important, the carbon footprint, and think about the carbon footprint. But sometimes I feel like there is almost like a conflict between the carbon footprint debate and the biodiversity debate. And we need to kind of merge that and think that as something we need to bring together. Perhaps the way to do this all through is to take, like Julia Watson has been doing in her low-tech book, take indigenous knowledge more seriously. That could be one path. I find that inspiring, though perhaps too romantic. I don't know. I don't think she means it that way. But there's something here to be learned from cultures and traditions that we may not associate with urban life. Maybe there are insights and wisdoms there we can harvest, so to speak, if that's a good word, to make things better. All right, so summarize. Away from the anthropocentric towards the biocentric. Think hard about population growth. How to think about the city as this place that is actually moving, the bricks, the mortar, the birds, the people, everyone. Appreciate the animals are able to adapt. Think hard about how to accommodate animals who are unable to adapt or are dying out. And we are living in the 6th extinction right now with species dying out at a record speed. Animal-aided design, design that's friendly to birds and fish, insect-aided design, plant-aided design. Think hard about carbon footprints, but don't let carbon footprint be the only measurement of environmental success. Also, biodiversity and is important. And then look for knowledge from people everywhere that may not be familiar places to look. Architecture without architects kind of investigations and indigenous knowledge could be a start. But that was about it. And if you don't find this convincing, check it out, the article on Topos, where it's all published with all the footnotes and blah, blah, blah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter Anka. Fascinating, biodiversity. The bit of a confusion earlier about the sequence was actually in fact correct. So we'll go back to where we were going to start with Lydia Calipoliti from the Cooper Union in New York, now based at the moment in Greece, architect, writer, curator, and director of her practice, Anacycle. And Lydia will be presenting her paper titled Biocontrol, Microclimates, and Domestic Machines. Lydia.
So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be among you and to follow on the equally and even more so amazing Peter Anker. I'm going to speak to you today, maybe not so much in offering a solution or saying what we should be doing, but mostly my talk will be focused on dismantling an artifact that in a very banal way, I call the bubble. And I'm slightly revising the title of my talk as Bubble Problems and Archaeology of Ecology, Infection, and Environmental Control. But the bubble is not just a morphological construct in my mind. It is inherent in the way that not only we build spaces and we contain ourselves, even in the way that we have done that prior to the pandemic, but also it's an artifact that an existential artifact, a willful desire to contain ourselves inside. So one of the things that was that started this kind of thought process was that during the clickbait of the COVID-19 crisis, when it started early on in April, all of these images circulated in social media about bubbles. The icon of the bubble and decontamination, they have resurged without return. And these are some of the images that I have found in my social media feed. So projects like House Rucker Co.'s masks, balloons, and mind expanders became prophetic all of a sudden. Coop Himmelblau's restless sphere in Basel was also prophetic. So was Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan. And along with many other bubbles as organizations of containment and engineered safety. Bubbles are both emblems of climatic control as well as the hygienic conception of a pure, disinfected atmosphere, one that is regimented and safeguarded for selected subjects that are shielded inside what we call, in some ways, immunological space. So the father figure, if we go to the father figure of environmental control, Rainer Banham, this is extraordinarily famous, nothing interesting or original to see here. He was quite explicit in announcing this famous project, the environmental bubble, as a hygienic project. Even though he was nude in the bubble because the machines would bring the temperature to such a pleasurable degree that he could rid himself of clothing, he was fixated on screening out noxious atmospheric pollutants from the domestic interior. And his advocacy in the 60s for conditioning indoor air quality sprang from very much older investigations in the evolution of building systems throughout the 19th century, a practice that was determined at the time by medical practitioners. Doctors were directly transferring their medical knowledge in the environmental management of airflows. In this light, the tempered interior The regulation of certain levels of temperature and humidity was a kind of remedial treatment to the pathology of what he called the unregulated airflow. And this was the plan of a doctor to regulate airflow relative to the spreading of disease. So in referencing Conrad Meyer in 1904, he wrote that early justifications of air conditioning were weaponized against excessive amounts of water vapor, sickly odors from respiratory organs, unclean teeth, perspiration, untidy clothing, the presence of microbes due to various conditions, stuffy air from dusty carpets and draperies, and other causes of discomfort and ill health. So to paraphrase his own text, wash your hands and come back for the next paragraph. It is important to remember, nevertheless, that the bubble is not just a defensive medium from a kind of epidemic outside of danger, pollution, and disease. It also becomes an existential medium to detach oneself, an individual, from a collective of the urban fabric and the social sphere. Besides a prophylactic, the bubble is a machine for calibrating the human and material capital inside the boundaries of a certain perimeter. It might have been the case that in the 60s, and this is also, I'm showing only very famous things here, that the bubble cannot be detached from the framework of social and political unrest that rendered cities in the 60s and 70s as dark places of pollution, smog, places that were lacking oxygen. It not only controlled the weather for the comfort and leisure of selected shielded subjects, but it also became a kind of defensive medium, like in the case of disease, from the filth, ugliness, congestion, and noise. And these are the words of geophysicist and oceanographer Athelstan Spielhaus when he was writing them for his experimental city in Minnesota in 1968. Aside from the idea of comfort and well-being, the construction of interior weather was on many fronts also a cosmological project. It was a project of sovereignty to conquer territories and control populations that are inside. At the same time, harnessing the weather inside a jar, a sealed space, reflects an understanding of bodies as mechanical tools inside a constant atmospheric medium to control and predict their behavior and growth. The bubble, or in that case, any kind of enclosure that is climatically controlled, has enforced, in many ways or forms, a power structure that could maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. It provides a homogenized atmosphere to predict the behavior and growth of bodies. For the philosopher and physician George Ganguien, it is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life a modern character. If we examine bodies explicitly as mechanical structures, as within a physical equilibrium, we cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. So controlled bodies encircled in the premises of quarantined experiments are nowhere more evident than in the visualization of containment looking inside through airlocks. And today, architectures of containment have acquired new forms of resonance in our pandemic reality. The view through the airlock that you've seen in this archival picture of Bios 3 in the 1970s is now representative of a current state of induced paralysis and the requirement to stay at home. In the photographic lens of Stephen Lovkin, thousands of citizens in New York look up to the outside with dire longing, hoping for a day when we can regulate our porosity between inside and outside. So in this day and time, the protocols of how one may navigate territoriality between inside and outside is entirely renewed. The process of departure and re-entry, at least at the start of the pandemic, made the door, expanded the door into an airlock of serial decontamination steps. The door became an airlock that was needed to enter the unfriendly and unforgiving void of the outside. And households became a little bit spaceships, while the outside was a kind of non-cohesive space of constellations of essential places. Yet in some cases, this moment has already happened before the pandemic. Living indoors, delimited and synced, was already a prevalent mode of experiencing the world before the pandemic. In fact, according to the 2018 Indoor Air Quality Report from the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans spent 90% of their time indoors. Inside, the need to connect online was the most vital need that one had had. It was more vital in comparison to air quality. So why were we so eager to return to an allegedly normal state and quickly fall back to the same position, especially considering that the propensity to stay synced inside and conceptualize the house as a world of its own has been prevalent before the pandemic. In his COVID-19 lockdown survival guide, Slavoj Žižek narrated that even before the lockdown, he willingly chose to stay inside when traveling rather than go outside and check monuments and sites when he was on the road. Today, it's the impossibility of negation of the choice to not go outside that has turned containment into a terrifying threat. To address containment, in many ways, a new kind of criticism is needed. New ways to fathom architectural legacies of interiorization, climatic control, and fear of infection. For the reality of the inside is also generating its own hysteria. In all likelihood, the bubble comes back to bite us. Beyond isolation, containment, and shielding, we need bubbles to burst and bodies to unpack and reconfigure, bodies to live among pollution and infection. As a famous movie line suggests, open your eyes to the bubble inside which you are voluntarily contained. Then develop an erotic yet resistant relationship with your containment. In that way, it might be possible to penetrate barriers and imagine other ways of being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. That's wonderful. Next, we have Alberto Estevez, once again, the director of Masters of Biodigital Architecture at UIC in Barcelona, who will present his paper, Nature is the Solution, Biodigital Architecture and Genetics. Welcome, Alberto.
Okay, thank you. I want to see how to do this now. Okay. And yeah. So, okay, I think you can see this well. So thank you for the invitation. And yes, I was preparing this little presentation about what we are doing in our institute, in our research group, in our master, because have to do with at the end explaining also what we was doing because this COVID pandemic, and understanding from the beginning that these planetary problems, that health, ecology, economy, and equity goes together, and the solution needs to be considering together, of course. And I propose from the side that we are working that nature is the solution also, because from Barcelona in Gaudí was this sentence of nature, which is always my master, the great book, always open, and which we need to make an effort to read. And this is what we was speaking about, what is biolearning. Biolearning, so to understand what nature can teach us, and what we can design, with what we can educate, innovate, putting our little grain of sand in this planet for mankind. And in the beginning, we was understanding these genetic similarities between the building power of nature and working with laboratories of genetics and building power of digital architecture, also organizing in Spain the first digital workshop. And with these comparisons that natural intelligence, artificial intelligence, biolearning, machine learning, biomanufacturing, digital manufacturing, so as keywords of this cloud that what is biodigital, and trying with our work to make a fusion of biology and digital, understanding that this is the way to solve. Here, I was putting that the cities of the future will be 50% biological and 50% digital, or they don't will be. So what we are doing is this so fast these workshops and these master and these projects and these works and these designs, also considering all the time the need of self-sufficient, of also passive architecture, and also the integration from the biolearning to how biology, how nature are making a better environment in our buildings. Our publications that we are doing also with the professors that come to teach in our master and our conferences that we are doing every 3 years, and events, exhibitions, etc. But what is behind is this, our reality, and this is something that now also with COVID becomes really really was urgent, but now it's really urgent to think that we cannot follow these contradictions that sometimes, because it's so cool to go to Mars, we forget that that we need first to solve our problems. And this is why with the same way material and tools that we can build in Mars, we can do it in all the deserts of the planet, cheaper, faster, easier, and safer. Or we will be in this kind of planet Earth that Blade Runner 2 was making the prophecy. But the reality is this: we are destroying, as Peter was saying, we are destroying really all our biodiversity, and we cannot more stay without doing nothing. And more we that are educating the future designers, the future architects, and what we are proposing from 2000 and before was that life is really the solution of our problems, urban problems, domestic problems, and understanding that we need to change really from 20th to 21st century with the tools and the possibilities that we have. And life is really now with the new techniques and also biological and digital techniques, the possibility to overcome and to explain what need to be the future of our architecture and our designs. I am making these little comparisons because until now, our professors are teaching us paradigm what was the paradigm of 100 years, and they can they resist as a modern academia to follow what we really can research and what we really can do only with open mind and finding funds for do it. We was doing from the genetic laboratory with the geneticists working first in bioluminescence, making that in this case the gene of this medusa in some lemon trees, and also making so this kind of bio lamps in living light. But now we come to COVID, yeah, and this and this was really discovering a lot of things with COVID. First was that in every little place was growing plants that you never was seeing this place, only because nobody was cutting the grass, nobody was cutting plants or trees, and this takes in only 2 months of confinement a explosion of life everywhere, and as Peter was saying, we need to rebel. And I was making this kind of urban action of let life grow, putting these signals everywhere, and some municipalities understand it. In Barcelona, they begin to do a public policy of don't cut grass as we was doing by decades. But at the same time, in Canada, some people that wasn't preserving this biodiversity in their own gardens, the police come and make them pay because they need to obligatory to cut the biodiversity that is growing around. And also other discoveries was this, that the dramatic situation that the people without balconies was living in this confinement. And the first consequence of this was that the prices of the houses with balconies and terraces was rising up. And in this case, I was designing these little possibilities to put balconies to this discovering that the intermediate spaces are really advantage that we cannot avoid. And also in the objects, so we see from one side the environment, the biodiversity that makes that recognize how we can recognize that the absence of humans let that the nature take the control again. In second place was this how the people begin to go to the second residence, discovering that also the work with computers, internet, don't need that they go to the city. And this makes also that the prices of houses begin to rise, houses outside of the cities, for example. And also in design, in objects, the explosion of designers that voluntary, they began to print masks to put in internet for free. And we was also designing this mask, understanding that the mask become the protagonist of all these days. And but how to do so that we don't lose the for example, the smile of the people. So and that the mask needs to be recyclable, because we was fighting against plastics, and now our garbage are masks everywhere that the people let everywhere. And this was also from another action, painting this little ace in a special tree that it's in Barcelona also, so that the people wake to nature, or to understanding that nature is watching us, or that understanding that yes, that we cannot go around in the city without understanding that we need nature everywhere, and that we need to let nature grow. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Fascinating. Next presenting, we have Giovanni Barassi, who's director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the CCA, joining us from Montreal.
Was it Claudia or, oops, sorry. Is it Giovanni or Claudia? Giovanna or Claudia?
You actually surprised me. Like, you continue to change the list.
Yeah, I thought it was
Claudia. I think it was Claudia to go next.
Claudia, professor for landscape architecture at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Claudia is lecturer in architecture at Bartlett at University College London and director of Ecologic Studio together with Marco Poletto.
Hi. Thank you, Tom, and everybody for the invite. It's nice to see you all. Today, I would like to share some thought on a few recent articles Mark and myself have been writing on the subject of how design and visual language can contribute to the redesign of the urban microbiome. So it is timely in the Anthropocene, and even more so due to the current global pandemic, to search for what also other speakers has underlined as a non-anthropocentric mode of reasoning and therefore designing. The Photosynthetic Consortium, which I founded with Marco Poletto and our team, and has been established in 2018 and include Ecology Studio, the Urban Morphogenesis Lab at the Bartlett, and the Synthetic Landscape Lab at Innsbruck University. The consortium has been pursuing architecture as a research-based practice exploring the interdependence of human and biological intelligence in design by working directly with non-human living organisms like the cyanobacteria that you see here in the urban hosted by the urban algae Arus. For us, the question is, how can we reassess what somebody has called the dark side of urban ecology? This implies bringing the focus a different aesthetic on nature. It is a consequence of the urban landscape. This aesthetic creates a focus on the realm of microorganisms, such as virus, bacteria, fungi, and cyanobacteria, again, protagonist of most of my presentation today. These creatures, though, induce often fear because their technique elude our human comprehension. In architecture, we have inherited from modernity a sanitized view of aesthetic, whereas the wide surface is still dominating, as well as the city, where often zoning is still the predominant paradigm. But bacteria and microorganisms are not only the dark side of ecology, they can also have incredible property of turning what we consider waste and pollution into nutrients and raw material. From this perspective, my practice has been investigating biodigital architecture that promote a form of urban aesthetic centered on a novel appreciation of the microscale of bacteria, as well as other forms of non-human intelligence. Within our body of work, the cultivation of these microorganisms becomes an act of culturalization. Can we provide these organisms with a form of bio-citizens? An example of this type of exploration is the series Hortus. We started in 2011 at the Architectural Association in London. Hortus is the Latin term for the word garden, but here operate as an acronym for hydro-organism responsive to urban stimuli. It refers to a series of photosynthetic sculptures and urban structures that create artificial habitats for cyanobacteria integrated in the built environment. Within Hortus, cyanobacteria are deployed not only as photosynthetic machines, but also as organisms able to absorb emission from the building itself. They constitute an active layer of both the urban and the natural metabolic cycle. They aim at creating correlationship between the dark cycle ecology, they are, after all, a consequence of climate change. Algae are blooming over many of the seas of our planet. And green ecology. They are able to remetabolize some of the byproduct of our urban infrastructure. This symbiotic relationship has been explored in a project recently unveiled in Tokyo at the Mori Art Museum, which you see also in my background, where we have Tokyo. Suspended on the 53rd floor of the Mori Tower against the backdrop of Tokyo urban sprawl, the sculptor materialized its urban dimension as a prototype of living architecture. The photosynthetic tower explored, through a series of associated speculative images, the architectural implication of the evolution of Tokyo into a future powerhouse, a biodigital culture and technology. At the city scale, it appears as a complex synthetic organism in which bacteria, autonomous farming machines, and other forms of animal intelligence become, alongside humans, biocitizens, contributing to the formation and transformation of Tokyo's own synthetic urban landscape. This prototype materialized spatially elements that deal directly with urban metabolism. Here in the Biotech Hut, our first permanent photosynthetic architecture, are contained 4,000 liters of cyanobacteria culture. These cultures are able to sustain the building energetically. They're able to produce protein that are equivalent to the one that will be produced by the breeding of 13 cows, and are also able to absorb CO2 at the rate of 30 large trees. But what are these numbers? They are not here to justify the architecture. Rather, they are here to create space and articulate numbers in spatial organization, to mediate between the human and the non-human. They propose a shift from the architecture as a living machine, the machine for living, to architecture as a living machine. In order to promote the evolution of this concept, we have recently launched, as I said at the beginning, the photosynthetic venture, which is focused on transdisciplinarity between design, biology, and computation. The first photosynthetic demonstrator was unveiled in November 2018 in Dublin, that you see here. It's 32 meters long and 7 meters high, and take the form of an urban curtain. The photosynthetic building membrane captures CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it in real time at the rate of approximately 1 kilo of CO2 per day. It constitutes of 3 layers: the wetware, that is constituted by the selection and management of living microalgae cartoon, the software, the digital management system, the hardware, the artificial habitat for cultivation of living culture, or photobioreactor. The project combined digital design and fabrication technology to develop aesthetic qualities, environmental performance, and architectural integration. When scaled up, Photosynthetica hopes to actualize a relationship between economic, social, and environmental health benefit. The project embodies the long-term benefit of adopting a carbon-absorbing technology, as it is 10 times more efficient at carbon sequestration than any other nature-based green technology. The pandemic that is currently engulfing the world is a direct manifestation of the imbalances within the urban sphere. While chronic exposure to air pollution affects our lungs and weakens our immune system, unsustainable food supply chain and practices are and will continue to vector increasing number of pathogens within our body. To conclude, the future of architecture emerging from the landscape of the post-Anthropocene could be considered by us as wet, soft, and behavioral. It is embedded with intelligence that is distributed and embodied. Cities are evolving into intelligent superorganisms and shall become capable of searching for opportunity of coevolution within the urban sphere. Green City must be able to find untapped resources while minimizing the expenditure of energy required to accomplish the task. These will be cities hosting both human and non-human citizens. New form of evolving non-human intelligence will conceive them. Within this post-anthropocentric city, the impact of artificial systems on the biosphere will indeed be global, but their agency will no longer be entirely human. New biocomputational design workflow will eventually evolve, pairing what is algorithmically drawn to what is biologically drawn in redesigning the urban microbiomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Wonderful. And now, well, last but not very least at all, of the 5 presenters, Giovanni Barassi, who's the director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. Welcome, Giovanni.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks, Nader, for the invitation and for all these fantastic presentations. Let me share my screen. So I would like to share with you some thoughts regarding this kind of relationship between the city and health issues and somehow the territory of the city and its connection also to nature, understanding nature also in a kind of broad sense, but also tackling also some of the issues that I think are crucial to the discussion today, that are not only a question of health and ecology, but also a question of economy and equity. So we all know that the 19th century cities were polluted, dirty, muddy, too dense and unhealthy, and somehow nature was considered the healing element. So if you will have allergies or respiratory issues, you will certainly be sent to a forest or to actually go near the sea and kind of breathe the air of the sea as a kind of curative means. So the idea was that nature was good and was actually the things will heal us. And that's somehow the ideas also that brought Olmsted to kind of produce this idea of public parks in the city and somehow consider them the kind of lungs for the city. But it's interesting because this were not only seen as a kind of healing component, but we're also a kind of democratization of nature because the park will be public and will be accessible. So the question also of equity and health was actually also intertwined in those projects. And at the same time, in that period, was not only an idea that a park will be the solution in the city to kind of cure you, but obviously this was paralleled with an idea of architecture that will be where sun, light, ventilation, exercise, and roof terraces and hygiene was very much part of the idea of architecture. And this was means were offered to prevent, if not cure, illnesses. So the architecture or the building will become a kind of machine for health. And even if these forms were not really, maybe this way of enacting health in the city were not necessarily a cure, but a kind of performative or an aesthetic of like what health looks like. So there was a kind of desire of a kind of maybe a kind of more well being condition for all humanity somehow. However, is like we see how this idea has been this image of the city as a curative place has also been put it at risk now, and somehow we see in this period of COVID how people are continuously considering of fleeing the city and in favor of suburbs and rural areas, considering again that these will be the places where maybe they will be safer and there will be in this less dense conditions and so on. So we're going back to a kind of 1950s return to the suburbs. Now things are changed, and we have understood that nature is actually not the cure anymore, as because we are facing with the fact that we are actually dealing with a second nature, that is this nature that we all have changed, and somehow we have so much work on the environment that somehow we are becoming allergic to ourselves somehow. So actually the nature is not anymore the safe place. And so somehow the city is coming back as actually one of the places that maybe hits with not only with the limits, but somehow with some of the opportunities can become actually maybe what we think understand much more as a healthy place. So we have seen in the past, like the idea that architecture can be proactively introducing changes in health and actually inducing with programs of incentive to walk, all these kind of fit city things, but also programs of urban agriculture. We have heard also other kind of ideas in the previous talks, and increasing biodiversity and so on. So somehow the city, with all the limits it has, can also enhance all this kind of, if not cure, somehow addressing with also the opportunity of the density, some of the issues that are related to health and equity and so on. In fact, in a kind of society where now we are living in a kind of much denser way, the idea of using public transportation, share, all kind of other things is actually bringing maybe a healthier system for other reasons. I will just share this.
We have about 200,000 years of history collectively living in groups, and about 60 years of living alone. The social change is extraordinary. 22% of Americans were single in 1950. 49% of American adults are single today. 9% of one-person households in 1950. 28% of all households have just one person today. The fastest growing segment of people who live alone are young adults under the age of 35. Now it is an urban condition. Next slide, please. Living alone is more common in Canada and family-centric Japan. It is more common in most of the societies in Europe with which we normally compare ourselves, and it is by far the most common in the Scandinavian countries. In Stockholm, 60% of all households have just one person. Next slide. Our lives are different today than they've been in the past. Living alone is made possible by economic affluence and security. This is the new demographic that for me is the most fascinating. You don't see social changes like this very often. You also can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the communications revolution. Is there anything more innovative than changing the entire way in which we organize our lives and our households?
So somehow it's very complex how we look at the city now. And this is just a piece of a new documentary that we have produced at the CCA that is actually part of a series that looks at the changes of the city in this moment. So the kind of rising number and increased number of people living alone, I think, is intertwined with a lot of the question about density, and somehow some of the current studies is like that all these people living alone, somehow they tend to be living in the city, they tend to share transportation, and somehow, so we might even think is a much more environmentally concerned city that what we have imagined before. And because they live alone, they tend actually to share much more with other communities and groups. So somehow the city in this moment has all this kind of complexity about the population and about also how we organize our time. So the kind of division that we have seen in the past between the time that we rest and the time that we work, obviously we know very well how has been becoming obsolete and challenged to the fact that at this point has blurred to the point that we actually live in our office and maybe the home, it doesn't really exist anymore. But I think this, one of the things that COVID has exposed somehow, and I think is one of the positive things that has revealed to those one who are privileged and often just out of reach of certain effects, is all the inequalities and fragility of our system. So the city and the downtown has kind of lost its daily workers and somehow have revealed homelessness, for example. It became much more evident, and we have all seen images of this period. And so basically all these other questions that were already there, and then they were kind of part of the fragility of the ecology of the city, are becoming much more evident. So the on the other side, we have seen that the size and the proximity of the people in the city has been, that some parts has been seen as a threat, as we have heard also, as becoming a way of allowing gathering, sharing of resources of that are maybe not possible in other geographies, or mutual aid, or so access to food, healthcare, and childcare. So somehow the things is that we will continue to dwell of like, is the city a kind of healthy place or not? It really depends of like which is the priority that we have and which is a kind of angle that we look at. If we look at it on the point of view of the single and individual point of view, or in the point of view of a community. But I think the other things that beside the kind of people moving into the suburbs as a kind of reaction to the kind of COVID, and thinking that that was maybe a solution to being more distant from other people, we have actually seen other forms of interrelation, I would say, between the cities and maybe what is in certain territory, the periphery, or kind of small other cities, or even rural areas. I think we all remember the phenomenon in 2018 in France of the Gilets jaunes, and this has really revealed a kind of gap between cultural, social, and geographical that I think is fundamental, that oppose a kind of popular bloc on one side and kind of bourgeois of the periphery to a kind of bourgeoisie bloc of the city. And the Gilets jaunes are a kind of the expression in France. We have seen Brexit in the UK, and we know very well what's happening in the States. So I think the perception of these two populations to live inside an economy that is very distant geographically, but is also culturally, and somehow is also where the wealth is created. So somehow it's based on a kind of an inequality that concentrates wealth and in the larger cities. And so somehow the idea that these other territories, they are sort of like serving the city. And I think the risk in the future is what we have actually, for example, seen of company like Facebook, who will think that they will go to kind of remote work, and they will even thinking of paying less if people will move to areas where the cost of living is less. So somehow this idea of, again, using this kind of digital and remote work as a way of really creating, again, this kind of inequality between these territories and the large city. So again, I think this dynamic that looking at the cities and looking at this relation between a kind of health and equity should also look at the city and at this enlarged territory, and somehow this kind of relation between the two. I think, just to conclude, I think that the vaccine will not be the solution, and I think the city and the built environment should actually form a kind of ideas and governance and form a kind of more intricate idea where this other important aspect that is not only the health but also the idea of equity will become part of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. Nader, will you unmute and...
Yeah, thank you for these really extraordinary and thought-provoking presentations. And I really sincerely hope that this is really the beginning of a longer-term, years-long conversation rather than an isolated event. And in order to kind of bridge the discussion with our respondents, our in-house faculty, and with our distinguished speakers, I wanted to maybe isolate one theme that I heard coming through in many of the presentations, and the theme is health. And it seems that many of you spoke about health from a variety and its meanings from a variety of different perspectives. The modernists, for example, I think understood health principally through a biological lens. In other words, through the lens of light, air, and sun. And along those lines, we might think of the functionalists of the early 20th century and figures like Le Corbusier. But if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like many of you are arguing for a more maybe complicated understanding of what health could mean today vis-a-vis our cities and vis-a-vis a response to the pandemic. So I was wondering if you could maybe chime in on what health means to you, and perhaps by extension even illness with respect to contemporary life and the pandemic.
Well, if maybe I start briefly. I don't see it as more complicated, as we used to say in discussion at EA, maybe more complex in the sense of complex system, because it can be complicated enough to do a very sanitized, white, sharp detail that you clean very easily, so that it can be quite complicated in terms of manufacturing. But on the other hand, I think that and all architecture that proposed a certain approach to health was surely contextualized in this socio-political environment. But for me, health is dealing with health is dealing with complexity, with interconnection, and essentially with the development of knowledge. How do we develop a more in-depth knowledge of the system, of the non-human system that surround us? And how can we somehow interact with them through tactics? So bacteria, viruses, fungi, they have systemic tactics. They don't stop on a wall or on a white surface. So how do we develop languages that are both logical, but maybe also visual? And here design, I think, can have a great impact to understand their pattern of movement, the way we can benefit from the interaction with the non-human form of life, but also the way we can interrelate and create a communication. I think that is the shift that we need to somehow work on. We don't clean the planet, because the planet is not possible to be cleaned. We don't simply protect ourselves from viruses and bacteria, but we understand the planet in a different manner, and we create a dialogue with the planet. So that's where architecture and visual language can contribute, I think, in exposing some of the processes that at the moment are hidden in the walls, even in the factory that are far away from the city. So how can we expose and design some of these processes and therefore create a different communication with the system that create the urban sphere and the dialogue between the urban sphere and the biosphere? That's my take.
Okay, if nobody speak, I can say little things. For example, I see very interesting that exactly this roundtable is health, ecology, economy, and equity, because really this goes absolutely together, and we see this especially from when COVID was here, saying that economy and equity and health are absolutely close together. People that have not possibilities, better possibilities in economy and equity, they have in this pandemic situation was absolutely destroyed his economy, and making bigger the problems of equity. We know not so much years ago that the problems of ecology can be only solved if we solve the problems of poverty and equity. It's not possible to separate ecology and equity. And now with the pandemic, we see very clear that we cannot separate health, economy, and equity. And at the end, we see also because this pandemic that this is a problem for all of us. It's not only at the end for some people that have problems when all the people are close at home. That at the end, all humans have to react with a very big solidarity that we have discovered, especially in these days of pandemic, I think. No.
Well, I think that thanks, Nader, to pointing of what we intend as health, because I think that yeah, I think it's a crucial discussion of like, well, you know, when we will say it's a healthy city, what it means, and I think this is continuously evolving. Of you know, I think it's parallel to even the notion of, I don't know, of like how the notion of sustainability has moved, like from the early definition to then increasingly capturing a much more complexity. So I think the issue is now that some of the things that apparently might be healthy, then they turn out to not be, and that's always a kind of complexity. And I think in architecture also, because I say we architects, because I'm an architect too, we tend to be enthusiastic about things when they you know, but then we discover that maybe they were not really a great solution. So I think is the complexity. Like, this is why I showed you just briefly that things about living alone, that is one of these changes that are happening now. And on one side you might think it's a disaster, on the other side might be also a kind of more more sustainable or more healthy. So I think it's fascinating to actually really dwell of like what is healthy now in terms of like what are these different yeah, priorities somehow.
I'll chime in if I may. I agree with all the speakers, and I think it's we are in a dark time, and I think Claudia spoke to it. We cannot clean the planet, but we have to understand the complexity. We have to understand the age of extinction, the dark kind of new second nature that we're all immersed in, where we're flowing. We cannot shield ourselves from pollution. We breathe pollution. We flow through it daily. So all that is the main ideas of this post-humanist discourse are in a lot of discussions between academics and universities and critical thinkers. But one of the things that that is striking to me is that to make a change, we need to also, things need, as in an architectural discourse, there's a kind of tendency that things need to look a certain way, or we have a pre-existing desire that in a certain type of architecture we find within certain concepts. What do I mean by that? Yesterday, we were hosting a lecture at the Cooper Union by cooking sections, and they were trying to argue for the orange color of salmon and all of the geopolitical struggles in territories and harnessing different ecologies around the earth to make salmon look orange, because that's what we accept. So there are very strong legacies of things that we expect to find, of questions of legibility, literacy, of how we want, what we consider, what we want something to look as healthy. And I think that this is very, very important in any future moving forward, because I'm very much in favor, and in my work too, like I work with genetic engineers. I believe in creating waste, organic waste, as instruments, but how does that become a new modality of understanding health, ecology? I don't know if that makes sense. It's just an honest question I have.
I think it's something that we're all trying to think through collaboratively. Can we maybe hear from some of our respondents from in-house and your thoughts in terms of this question of what health could mean? Have you given thought to it in the context of your own research?
I can start.
Marcella, please.
So thanks everyone for the great input. So I think for the, also the discussion now, and so I think it's interesting, I think, to look at health also in relation to history of cities and public health, and how health and events related to health have changed urban forms. So if we look at cities before the 19th century, we are experiencing exactly the opposite. So they actually were the most unhealthy places to live. And so people were living outside of the city. So the city of the 20th century is a completely different city, and is a city that where we, in a way, we live now, where we're looking at the sanitation of urban life, right? So it's a completely opposite, where cities, in the 20th century, in terms of how, health issues in a way were resolved within the urban environment, you really start to look at the city as a sanitation of urban life and the public realm. So completely opposite up to the 19th century. And so I want to point out here, I think, the importance between those type of events and acceleration and urgency, because to me, the two go hand in hand. So I think on the one hand, the acceleration relates to how we conceive time, how time is important for these events to happen and to produce change. But also I think urgency is a very important parameter to understand the response that we can give. So the two are not disjunct, are not separate, right? But how these events, I think if we look at the history of the 20th century and cities, we look at the Spanish flu, we look, in the 1918 and then 1950. So the way in which these events have really changed urban forms is actually part of how we experience the city now. And these were not produced through slow change, but were produced by abrupt changes, by events that actually, because of the urgency, the city had to give quick responses. And to me, this is also strongly connected with utopia as well. Because if we look at utopias as relationship between the production of space and society, so perhaps now, also in the frame of nature, and I think some of the presentation touched upon that, maybe we can begin to project how, again, the distribution of nature in city and the relationship with utopia and acceleration and urgency start to really project a new scenario or a future scenario. So health, to me, it's in this, if you look at the macro, we look at the cities, but we look at the planetary, it's very, to me, it starts to, really looking from the outside in, from the scale of the global, then to the scale of the individual. I see it as an agent that has produced change in history, and at the same time allows us to rethink again, perhaps utopian, maybe dystopian visions, right? If we begin to look at and see the relationship between production of space and society. So this is more an open question of comment, and to see how, one question that during, with the lockdown for all of us is that where the city will be abandoned. I don't think the city will be abandoned, but probably the city will be transformed. And I think we are experiencing this, that maybe we're not even aware right now, right? Because we are in it, but we will proceed this, I think, as a trajectory, perhaps in a few years from now.
Don't say.
Great. So thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. If I may maybe continue the thread of thoughts and maybe reinforce some of the things that Lydia mentioned in terms of the relationship with these performative aspects in relation to our socio-political production of aesthetics within architectural culture, and also what Marcella talked about in terms of utopia. I just want to maybe frame the notion of health in the context of how we can talk about these things in relation to performative aspects of what we design. And the common thread that I saw in the presentations was that they were more about how an environment or environmental conditions are performed and modulated through our design, rather than just narrowly focusing on the frequent architectural discussions that are formally driven. And I think the performances that are talked about are also, especially in relation to health, are not just about mitigations, but it's about productively being productive and producing something that's positive, not in terms of material production, but also a cultural production. I think what's interesting about the collection of presentation that we had here, for me in particular, is how Peter talked about the environments and how they could perform better for animals and insects. How Lydia talked about, the control and maybe perhaps the modulation of air qualities in relation to the concept of the bubble, a spatial concept. How Alberto talked about the bio-learning and how it relates to discovering how nature performs beyond biomimicry. Claudia talking about how design and visualizations can effectively explicate how urban design, how urban microorganisms form, and how lastly, Giovanna talked about social performance of living and working alone that can touch on the discussions of density at the scale of interior and at the city scale. So maybe if we go back to just summarizing, I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the presentations you had. And my question is, what do you see, and maybe it goes back to the question of utopia, but what is the role of speculation and imagination in your own research and practice as a means to communicate and disseminate your important work to the larger public? And I think when we have the public on board with the ideas that we come up with, I think we gain much more traction. And I think one of the roles architects might have in steering these conversations might be in the way of disseminating this knowledge in a different way than other disciplines do. So I just want to raise that question and want to see if there are any responses to that question that I would like to raise for the panelists.
Thank you, Kim. Well, I'm maybe in a privileged position because I actually work in an institution where that's what you ask is really the role that we aim to have, that is actually bringing forward for the public, but also for the practice, some of the questions that we think they are key to discuss. And somehow the question we want to bring forward are often, if not always, really related to a kind of social aspects or kind of life of society and architecture and urbanism. So last year, for example, we worked on the issue of happiness, where we actually see how this has become a kind of pervasive thoughts that somehow become a kind of new agenda also for architects. It's like, I don't think that nobody wants to do a kind of sad architecture, but somehow this has become a kind of new agenda where you actually need to perform also a certain architecture and respond to certain forms that actually induce that emotion. So so I think that's through, at least the way we work is like trying to see what are these kind of questions that are arising at a kind of societal level, and then always ask where is architectural thinking, where is design, where are design practices, where are how these questions are embodied or not inside these different disciplines. And I think this is certainly crucial as an institution somehow.
Robert Cody, can I invite you to offer your thoughts?
Sure.
Either about the issues that Dong-Se raised, or about health, or
right. I think this question of health and how you live and dwell within architecture and buildings is important, and has become ever more important for our conversation and how we can think about making things to give us a better relationship to our environment. So continuing on what Dong-Se had to say about performance, I'd like to also add a question about policy within that, because I think more so than the past, I think architects have an opportunity to affect policy in the way that they consider or thinking about putting together architecture. And I think a lot of the conversation here could have an advancement in consideration of that idea of policy. So just kind of starting and moving along with how the presentations went. The first one about this kind of idea about environment and nature and animals and so on. Here in New York, obviously, we're surrounded by water and the problem of climate change and sea level rise and storms and all of those other things. Ask questions about how policy should be related to resiliency and resiliency strategies and mitigation. And could we consider re-articulating the brackish environment that surrounds us with clams and oysters, and how those bring shorebirds back into place, and how repopulating those areas with plants to create other kinds of resiliency, and then how do we live and dwell within that new zone? And I think that's an important consideration for architects, and has been a continuing part of my teaching. And then how can we then consider buildings that live in their environment? Can we make buildings that are alive? Can we think about a building as a thermodynamic system, as Keel Mo would talk about in a lot of his writings? And can we build buildings that also permit adaptability and more open space for both people and animals to have more space? Right? And how does that become a kind of strategy for policy and advancing green open space as a reoccurrent theme in rebuilding and rearticulating our cities? And then this idea of the bubble, and how can we break the bubble and resensitize this boundary? In the early 1910s and 20s, steam heat became a new way of heating buildings, particularly here in New York. And a lot of that was that it was a byproduct of producing energy. Con Edison plants and other things had all this excess energy. But what it also did was it provided an opportunity for buildings to have a mechanism to allow windows to be open even in the wintertime because of this excess energy that was being produced. And this was at a time when tuberculosis was rampant, and the idea of air and natural light was a part of our thinking about cities. But then that all was conquered in the 1950s with air conditioning when we hermetically sealed the box, and then found out that that was not such a healthy way to think about buildings. So can we advance an idea about a different thinking about the envelopment of buildings, that the inside and outside can act together to create opportunities for living maybe seasonally inside that space? And how can we then think about the way in which we might migrate inside of a building or an environment as we would in the natural environment? And I found Claudia's talk particularly interesting about this idea of photosynthetic architecture as a kind of energy process that rebalances our relationship with the natural environment. And I think that's a kind of really interesting proposition, and how buildings and cities can be more of an embodiment of a biological system that can help buildings act and cities act more like living bodies and environments. And then lastly, this question of living alone in relationship to our current condition. Obviously in larger cities, density and community and social interactions become much more easy for those that live alone, and maybe more preferential in a lot of ways. But it's also the kind of work scenario around of that environment that also perpetuates this problem of people living alone, because they get to go and experience all of these things, but not necessarily meet other people. But the suburbs are certainly not good for living alone, because then you're just living in an isolated little box and not really interacting in any which way, right? So this little venue that we're talking about, that we're sitting in right now, is obviously a way to break out of that suburban box and have a relationship, but it's certainly not the way we can live a healthy, stable relationship for the future. So I'll end at that and see if we have any comments in relationship to that conversation.
Well, I can jump in maybe with a hinge further comments and questions. I think the presentations, I mean, fabulous. My head's spinning from so much projective imagination on our screens, and also the insights of my wonderful colleagues. Picking up on maybe some of the issues about perhaps the future of urbanity and how we get there, and what the differences are maybe of today's context, perhaps in reference to Marcello, your points about the mitigation of health problems and ecological problems of the 19th century or the 20th century. Here we are well into the 21st century. And I think the problematics of this roundtable, they open up all sorts of complex overlapped relationships, much more complex world. We're a far bigger planet in terms of our population. Our problems are far greater than they may have been. Maybe we underestimate what the past was. But as much as our current context, health context, has to do with individual subjects ourselves, these are also planetary scale problems with sort of vast human populations intersecting, with complex global ecological, economic, social processes. And research fields interfacing and confronting these urgent challenges that we're addressing have a common reference, it seems, in their response, namely the application of technology in a sort of broad sense to address these crises. So we're witnessing for several decades immense transformations in our discipline, how we work, what it is we produce, how we produce it. And the question I would have is, what would the role of the leading edge of science and technology to address the complexity of these planetary scaled problems, to enter these problems, to manage them, to mitigate with respect to the impact upon cities? And how might the application of the leading edge of science and technology aid us better to address the impact of our future urbanism, of the diverse crises happening simultaneously, and to mitigate some of those adverse impacts?
Someone want to?
Well, for me, one of the way to tackle this issue is distributed design innovation. So it's not technology per se, and it's not one technology, but it's how design can unpack a technology and distribute it so that each single unit in a bottom-up manner can have an effect on the overall city. So collectively, we can all act on our health and on the health of the city through the embedment of technology into architectural system. So it's not one specific technology, but is how technology can be distributed and unpacked. So we can harvest the collective intelligence of human and non-human, but also human organisms that are part of the city through their interaction with processes that deal with health, but also with ecology. So for me, this is a really important step from the system we have now. How do we impact the system and make it collective from a top-down decision-making in the selection of technology that we deploy, that we have now?
Maybe
Well,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Should I go? Okay. It's I don't know if it's even related to technology. It is related though to this question of understanding ecological and health problems in a larger planetary scale. And one of the things that I enjoyed during the pandemic was witnessing the breaking points of globalization and realizing how new forms of localization, local context have reemerged, new forms of production locally, new alliances that are not part of a kind of planetary design or understanding the kind of a whole planet as one design. So I think this was extraordinarily interesting because there was a certain kind of hubris post World War II, and even historically, if we think of architecture, the Earth was seen as the kind of stage set of design, and we think of Bucky, John McHale, all of these figures that have done that. So territorial design was. It is related very much to technology because it is a practice of distributed information and it uses data to do so. So it is a technology problem without machines, right? Or with fewer machines. But I think that this kind of, the breaking points that we witnessed were an interesting, I wouldn't call it a lesson, but a way to kind of focus on more tactical, maybe contexts and kind of intervene in without having a kind of master plan of global order.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia, for this. And I was thinking, in addition to this, that I think it's very interesting to look at these breaking points or failures. And I think there are some interesting research already happening of especially in relation to food chain of actually where these failures were, and often were not about the production of food, but more about, I don't know, the packaging or the fact that you need something from another place. And so I think it's interesting how this has become, again, revealing all this fragility of the system at the local and the global scale. But I would say that I think the strange things has been that we always refer to this as a pandemic, but we also see in the responses of like how this has been affecting differently, and how each country, in respect to their culture and their values somehow, in terms of privacy or in terms of social equity or inequity, or have they responded so differently. So somehow we see that, and I think the immediate response was thinking, oh, the places where you know, everybody at the beginning, so like what will happen in Africa, you know, and we actually see it's not so dramatic there. So I actually think that it's very interesting also to see how the power of government, or the kind of connection of the community or things like this, has actually showed a very different response. And so I think it's interesting to think that disease is the same and is actually going through the earth, and somehow how the response has been so different because of even political decisions of like in respect to, I don't know, privacy and security, or economy, like what is more important and what is the priority. So yeah, I find it interesting the fact that it's the same thing, but is now revealing this local diversity also at all the level, as social, political, economical, in the kind of response. And yeah.
Thank you for that insight, Giovanna. There are two sentences that I want to just share with you all that constantly come in your mind, particularly in connection with your comments, Giovanna. And then I want to maybe open things up to our audience of participants. The quote comes from an Italian, and actually some of the most interesting debates taking place around COVID and the pandemic appear to be coming out of Italy. And it's by Marco de Aramo, whom I don't know, but it's an essay published in the New Left Review, where he writes, quote, "This is a quote unquote white collar quarantine, as the New York Times has it. The privileged lock themselves in houses with fast internet and full fridges, while the rest continue to travel on crowded subways and work elbow to elbow in contaminated environments." And I think that much of what you're saying, in a way, casts a light on the fact that, we have to also ask, healthy for whom, as we think about these issues. And health is, my own health, and I'm among the white-collar quarantine who has a full fridge upstairs. And it has, of course, been, at the expense of others who are risking themselves to assure that our Zoom infrastructure works, that our services work, that the food is there. So this issue of health and quarantine and density is a very profound and nuanced one. So thank you for that. We would love to hear from those of you who've been kind enough to join us this evening on your thoughts or questions you may have for our distinguished panelists, reflections, contributions.
Nader.
Yes, please, Giovanni.
I would like to thank, of course, our panelists for sharing their work and their research. Very interesting, and it stimulates lots of other thinking and coming in our discussion. And I think that one of you used the term metabolic and metabolism. I think, Claudia, you were talking about that, and your work kind of represented as a synthesis of also of that. But because of that, we are asked today to think metabolically about processes of constant transformation, substitution, and maintenance of things that are human and not human, and to rethink at the same time, not only what we build, what we have built, what we are going to build, but to rethink the structure, which is the policy, which is the social, which is the economic, And it's something that is, and going back to what Tom was saying, is not only affecting the locality, or the intervention of the locality doesn't solve often the problem. It just kind of represents a temporary solution to solve the result or the effect of a problem that is located, displayed in other geographical areas or in other social areas. And so it seems that we are kind of keep running, trying to stop the blood coming from one part to another, without really dealing with the massive issues that are at the base of this problem. Those problems are the expression of something that doesn't work in our society, that's been working or producing a negative effect in our societies, and that is very difficult to eradicate. So I do believe in a collective and in a kind of acupunctural strategy of introducing a miniaturized revolution everywhere, but simultaneously, and to raise a sensitivity everywhere. But I also believe that we need a strong actions that is also involving and impacting the big causes that have been producing the world that we are today, trying to shift those towards a different direction. I see those directions in all of your presentation, in all our discussion, and I would like for this direction to be more and more impactful in terms of eradicating the causes, and not only, of course, as we have to do, deal every day with the consequences of these causes and try to survive to those. So it's not a question, it's more a reflection for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Other questions?
I think that Giovanni is raising an important issue to me. And I very much appreciated the variety of how the different panelists approach the different themes. I thought it was a terrific set of presentations. I agree that if we don't have a global coordinated bottom-up, right, approach, because we see how systems have failed us for the last 50 years, I think that we are beyond utopia, right? Because all the science fiction movies that we see are kind of a joke comparing to what's going on in the reality, right? We are beyond Blade Runner, 30 years ahead of it, right? Because Blade Runner is 2049, and the pictures in San Francisco are today, right? 2020. So in that sense, I believe that there's no vocabulary, there's no imaginary, there's no science fiction that is dealing with the correlational ethical problems that we're living today, that on the one hand are globally enforced, right, by a system that cannot hold it any longer. I'm talking about late capitalism as a main source of many of the issues that we are living at. And at the same time, I agree that there are different cultures that are dealing with the pandemic and so on, but at the same time, you need just one person flying an airplane for that pandemic to come back again. So in a way, if it is not a global coordinated effort in a socialist way, right, I think that we are all dead, right? So in that sense, I agree with Giovanni and the presentations, but I want to raise up, just maybe finishing, because in a way we are due time, but I want to enhance the very interesting positions that Claudia set up, Claudia Pasquero, and also Lydia in relationship to Alberto's. The fact that we need a different aesthetic paradigm, and I think that what Claudia was referring to, the dark side of our inner aspirations, to me is something that we need to deconstruct culturally. Because Alberto, what he has been working on for more than 20 years about the biodigital architecture, to me it's a very interesting problem. I remember when I look at Alberto's studios early on, I said, well, this is very ugly, right? And now today it's like either you do that or you're dead, right? So to me it's very interesting what Claudio raised up and also what Lydia was saying about the orange of the salmon, right? If we are not able to understand that our aesthetic desires are the problem in themselves, right? We're never going to be able to propose something that goes beyond the level of comfort in terms of what the reference level is today. And I think today I find it very problematic when architecture wants to try to do things that are beautiful or things that are comfortable or that make people happy. I get really upset about it, because I would argue that that's exactly the problem, that the curatorial's work media, and the different systems are propelling systems of self-validation and self-comfortness that are apolitical, right? Whereas in reality, I would argue that what Claudia, Alberto, and Lydia, perhaps more frontally, and I know Giovanna and Pender also are addressing that, but more frontally, if you want a political project in terms of transforming the inner relationship that we have with what we think our values are and how we project what we think architecture should be. I think that to me today, that was the kind of more radical aspect of where we need to look at. So I really appreciate the different positions in terms of that, and to make us shake a little bit more, because you know, it's like 50 years that we have been talking about this, and the laws and the parameters are there, they're static, they don't move, right? So rebellion is one way, but I would argue that we also have to change ourselves the way that it was presented. So thank you for the panelists for an amazing, inspiring evening.
Thank you for having us. It was really amazing.
I'd like to thank all of the panelists and respondents really for your insights about which, if I could summarize what we've done today, we focused on snapshots of the critical context that we're all living, and we're really at the cusp of the future of urbanity. And I don't say that sort of dramatically. We're all aware that these sudden critical events that happen to our society and our cities do have a really immense capacity to alter the stability of our context, and that's really where we're at right now. And we've, through history, we've understood that these kinds of critical moments can be amazing triggers for deep changes in the guiding paradigms and values, as you say, Pablo, in an era. And I'm not only proud of our disciplines, of the design disciplines and architecture as a kind of broad sort of umbrella, in our capacity really to assert ourselves through radical speculations of the future. And we're actually, that's our expertise, is how we conceive and communicate. And in our normal sort of sense, we do that on an everyday basis. What we're doing here tonight and really in our everyday lives right now is trying to conceive and communicate what the future will be. And I believe that this kind of hive mind, let's say, of a mode in which to discover the future is probably the best mode in which to do it. Although we are living relatively in isolation, this kind of communication is essential for what we understand as urbanity, which is the density of interaction and communication. So I thank you all for being here this long and for your wonderful insights and speculations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we hope we get to continue this conversation.
Yeah, we look for, actually, we're going to continue next semester with the same set of issues, looking at problems of codes, problems of zoning, and so on. So thank you, everybody, and we will continue with this conversation.